So thank you for coming. And thank you, Mona, for inviting me and for that very nice introduction. I'm honored and very pleased to be here in Beirut. It's my first visit and a wonderful opportunity. Anna's been taking me around. So it's been a wonderful opportunity to learn a little bit more about your city, about its maddening complexities and its beauty. And I'm very happy to be here to share in the discussions we will be having on topics that affect all of us in terms of the cities we live and work in. So Mona's introduction sort of basically covers half my talk, so maybe I can just stop right there. But I'll do a slightly different take. So I want to do two things today. First, I want to address the question of what it is that we know of informality. We all agree it's important. We wouldn't be here otherwise. But increasingly, among some of my design colleagues back at Cornell, there is a sense that it is a concept that has passed its prime and has lost its usefulness in helping us come to grips with the current urban condition, its chaos, complexity, and continual flux. Rahul Mehrotra of the GSD at Harvard has argued instead for the concept or the idea of the kinetic city. We have others like Rem Koolhaas and Hernando de Soto who celebrate informality and the entrepreneurial energies it brings to the fore, and yet others like Mike Davis who see in informality a dystopian future. We also have Ananya Roy, intentionally provoking us by suggesting that if planning is implicated in the production of informality, then better planning cannot be the answer. And that there is a territorial impossibility of governance, of justice, and development, that countries like India, like Lebanon, Egypt, or Ethiopia just cannot plan its cities. I do not agree that the concept of informality has lost its usefulness. In that sense, I'm with Mona on this. The extreme positions of celebration versus despair are not productive to my way of thinking. And while I laud Roy's attempts to demonstrate the critical limits of rational thought, analysis, and intervention, I would argue that we have to move beyond critique to embrace critical intervention, to embrace a kind of normativism that places the ideas of equity and justice at the center, even as we remain intensely aware of the dangers of ethnocentric prescriptive thinking. I would also contend that our obsessions with critique blinker us. It is with this in mind that I consider it important to remind ourselves of the origins of informality, its local intensities, and of the disjunctures and continuities between the informal and the formal realms. This is an exercise that is necessary to enact as we start 2 days of conversations here in this room on informality and how and in which kinds of ways informality should involve a rethinking of design and planning practice in various contexts. You will all, the speakers, or my colleagues, will all make presentations that highlight the particular. I seek to provide an overall framework through which to take on the exercise of comparison and learning. I said initially that I wanted to do two things. I spoke about the first. The second is to critique some recent forms of intervention, just a couple very briefly, and to use the use of strategic tactics by activists and designers who practice within the informal sector or the realm of informality. To critique is to expose a range of positions, to understand the consequences of actions, even as it is to understand what may be emancipatory, what may advance equity in the city and allow people to flourish. To critique is to keep one's gaze on the oppressive dimensions of informal structures, processes, and practices, and despite doing so, to make a reasoned argument for intervention. So I see little value in critique if it is not accompanied by ideas to shift the situation, to move the city in the directions of change we wish to see. So to return to my first intention, let me quickly trace the genealogy of the term informality, to add to Mona's narrative, and suggest a framework to understand the practices and processes in the informal city. I would like to propose that we bracket informal processes and practices by considering systems of production on the one hand and systems of maintenance on the other. Related to these two systemic conditions are the politics of informality and the production of the segregated spaces of the informal city. What do I mean by systems of production? Systems of production are processes and practices that generate housing, livelihoods, jobs. Systems of maintenance are service-oriented processes and practices that keep the city ticking, that keep it clean, that allow for mobility, however limited it may be, and allow for systems of production to flourish. For a long time, So for a long time, studies of systems of production were bifurcated by those disciplines that chose to look at informal production of housing and by other disciplines that sought to understand informality in economic processes and work. Many of you know that the informal economy, or the informal sector as it was called then, was first described, as Mona pointed out, by a British anthropologist, Keith Hart. And he was commissioned by the ILO, and his initial study actually was to look at income earning opportunities in Accra in Ghana, and then he moved to Kenya. So he drew a distinction, as she pointed out, between formal or wage earning employment and informal or self-employment outside the purview of the state. The concept spread from its African roots throughout the world. Researchers theorized that the sector would disappear as industrialization spread and economies grew. Contrary to these expectations, however, the informal sector continued to grow, and it began to accelerate as globalization and decentralized production networks spread rapidly, starting in the 1980s. Structural adjustment and neoliberalized development strategies of state retrenchment, privatization, and deregulation only compounded the trend. It was clear that the informal and the formal economies were inextricably linked and intertwined. Each rested and was nested in the other. The informal economy was unregulated and deeply gendered, reflecting all the power differentials that cut through society. So in 1989, the sociologists Manuel Castells and Alejandro Portes, in a seminal volume, sort of established that the informal economy was much more than the purview of the poor, and that it was prevalent across the world. And they described it as something that, and I quote from their book, simultaneously encompasses flexibility and exploitation, productivity and abuse, aggressive entrepreneurs and defenseless workers, libertarianism and greediness. And above all, there is a disenfranchisement of the institutionalized power conquered by labor, with much suffering in a 2-century-old struggle. So informal workers are employed in sweatshops, small factories, and home-based production networks. Sectors span many areas, from construction, manufacturing, street vending, food markets, the production of clothing, and more. Particular production processes within each sector, as well as caste, class, religion, education, gender, age, are all seen as crucial vectors in understanding the impacts of informality and the kinds of practices and processes that are adopted. And what sorts of space do these forms of informality generate in the city? Various studies from across the world have shown that low-income informal settlements, whether you call them slums, squatter settlements, auto-constructed and informally developed peripheries, inner city neighborhoods, all of these are sites for systems of production. As importantly, these spaces of production are generated by a series of forces that are local, regional, national, or global in scope. There are studies that demonstrate how systems of production result in patterns of use and appropriation on city streets. There's Dharavi again. And these same systems of production that sort of results in these kinds of appropriation of city streets, sidewalks, and public spaces are shaped by global and local processes, and they also shape patterns of city growth, as I have shown in my work in the cities of Ahmedabad and Delhi in India. So as important, though, as informal work is the production of informal housing. While informal economy work was pioneered in Africa, studies of the production of housing by and for the urban poor emerged in Latin America. In the post-World War II era, most southern countries saw massive migration of rural residents into cities. The increasing and largely unmet demand for low-income housing resulted in informal settlements. Favelas, barrios, gejekondus, bidonvilles, jhopatpattis, bastis, they went by many, many names. And they were all shaped by state policies on land, rental housing, service provision, and particular contexts. The initial state response was to always demolish illegal settlements, and it's still followed today under different imperatives. By the 1970s, though, as Mona pointed out as well, just as informal sector work was beginning to come into focus, a paradigm shift was underway, both in mainstream development and in the perception of informal settlements. Anarchist architects like John Turner emphasized the entrepreneurial spirit and the ethic of self-help housing, while sociologists who were also Marxists like Janice Perlman sought to dispel the myths of marginality associated with low-income settlements. Yet others, like Peter Ward, critiqued the emphasis on self-help as inherently exploitative. And notwithstanding this criticism, housing policies shifted to the provision of sites with a service connection, both to allow for state inability to provide mass social housing and to harness the productive entrepreneurial energies of residents, an idea that remains popular. Through the 1990s and continuing today, land titling to allow residents to release dead capital, in De Soto's words, upgrading to improve basic service provision, and transfers of development rights to enable slum redevelopment have emerged as preferred policy mechanisms. As in the informal economy literature, attention is paid to various vectors in the production of housing: gender, ethnicity, employment, the ability to pay, and also to property regimes, as well as the regulatory, socio-political, and technological context within which housing is constructed, bought, rented, and sold. We also know much more about non-state actors that take an active part in the production of informal housing, from NGOs and political movements to organized crime groups that Lisa Weinstein studied in Mumbai, who control redevelopment and upgrading in slums. Equally important is the production of informality in authoritarian regimes like China, where informality in housing is generated in two ways, very different from the rest of the world. First, by governmental systems that deny residency permits, or hukou, to rural migrants and do not guarantee them housing or any social benefits in the city. And second, by conflicts between various levels of government, central, provincial, and local, around land and redevelopment, real estate development in city peripheries. So in the Chinese situation, all rural migrants to cities are illegal or informal, as is the housing they occupy mostly in peripheral communities. So we're talking about something like 40% of Beijing's population is informal/illegal, right? So in most parts of the world, there is co-development in systems of production. Andrew Rumbach's work in Kolkata, India, or Martin Murray's work across various African cities, for example, demonstrates that the production of formal housing often produces construction and service work for people in the informal economy, who, choosing as they often do to settle close to jobs, build informal criminalized settlements close by. Of course, several of these planned formal settlements and manicured enclaves are themselves informal, yet are valorized by the state or whitened, as Oren Iftachel would have it. Now, I've characterized housing and various informal economy work as systems of production. What do I mean by systems of maintenance, many of which crisscross the city? The examples are countless, from small-scale water providers in the slums of Dhaka, Bangladesh, and the peripheral settlements of Maputo, Mozambique, to transportation systems that informal developers started in the outlying areas of Karachi, Pakistan. Or take the example of the dabbawalas of Mumbai, India, 5,000 of whom carry fresh food daily in dabbas or boxes from the homes of 175,000 or so workers and students in the suburbs to their places of work and study downtown. This is a hyper-efficient system that has continued without a break since its invention in 1890. Organized in groups of 20 or so men, the dabbawalas are all migrants from from a group of villages outside Mumbai. They share a caste status and most have low levels of education. Using Mumbai's linear train system, they move the dabbas or tiffins with their distinctive marking systems between 4 different groups of dabbawalas before delivering them at the lunch hour every day. Over time, sorting areas have been claimed on the streets, even as agreements have been forged with the railway authorities for sorting areas and stations, and even for special train compartments to carry the racks, each of which have 40 dabbas on them, between 10:30 and 11 a.m. every day. Studies done by various business schools indicate that the system rarely breaks down. Mistakes are as few as 1 in 6 million deliveries. And yet it remains outside regulation by the state in any way. Instead, the dabbawalas follow organizational practices that they invented and imposed through group disciplining structures. And this includes creating a distinctive marking system, which you see up there, for each dabba that makes its way up and down the train lines every day. And it also includes creating a supervisory system that privileges experience and age and imposes stiff fines on those who do not comply with group rules. Lest this sound too celebratory, remember that the system is built on exclusionary caste and gendered roles. There is not a single woman dabbawala. We can also consider systems of garbage and waste removal. Across cities of the global south, communities of waste pickers and recyclers are central to garbage clearance. Most famous of these community-based systems are those of the Zabalin and the Wahia of Cairo, who Raghi Assad studied as early as 1981, over 30 years ago. Here too is a narrative that underscores organization, a complicated arrangement between communities of different origins who came to the city at different points in time. The Wahia were the middlemen who collected fees for unsorted garbage pickup from buildings, while the Zabalin, with their donkey carts and now, of course, small trucks, picked up garbage, used their pigs to consume organic waste, after which women and children sorted through the garbage to recycle up to 80% of the waste. Here, too, the system is celebrated as much as it is reviled for keeping particular communities in exclusionary relations. In other parts of the world, from Brazil to the Philippines, as well as in my own work in a small city in India, there are examples of complex and organized ways in which informal processes and practices of garbage collection, composting, and recycling occur. These practices build on existing social relations. They're typically harmful to the health of the people doing the work, even as they provide very important livelihood opportunities and reveal entrepreneurial instincts that several researchers commend. These examples offer a measured and emphatic contrast to Koolhaas's claims of self-organizing entrepreneurialism in cities typified by the Lagos condition. So the spatial implications then of such systems of maintenance reflect the complex nature of systems that undergird cities. It can extend to Zabalin settlements of over 40,000 people living in Muqattam, my apologies for my accent, a peripheral settlement of Cairo, to the sorting spaces on streets and railway platforms for the dabbawalas of Mumbai, and the intricate systems of pipes and wells that the small-scale water providers of Maputo, Mozambique, lay down. City space is intersected and occupied in permanent, cyclical, and changing ways, reflecting the practices and processes of system maintenance. So what do I want us to take away from these narratives? First, that most everything in the contemporary southern city falls into these two categories of systems of maintenance and systems of production. Each of these systems is cut through by power, by practices that maintain exclusionary status of one group vis-a-vis another, by practices that involve spatial appropriation, and by practices that assert various bundles of claims against groups and against structures of governance, including that of the state. It is against this backdrop, that we have to consider our acts of intervention as designers and planners. So when I think of the word design, For me, it's a very broad and capacious term that includes various modes of intervention. They range from interventions in the private spaces of the home, in the spaces between buildings, in public spaces where people mingle, and in the design of policies that govern how we interact, where we may live, recreate, work, and thrive. So considering informality as systems and design as intervention, how do we think of critical intervention to advance equity in the city? Equity here is a normative idea that considers equal access to opportunity given different constructed inequalities of class, gender, caste, religious sect, or ethnicity. I use Amartya Sen's capabilities framework and its engagement with moral philosophy to get to a conception of the human good, or flourishing, as he calls it. I can describe this in more detail in the Q&A period if necessary. What is important for me to point out here is that it allows me to distinguish between different capabilities. Most of us would agree that we need a range of things in order to thrive. The range that each of us need would be somewhat different, based on whether we are young or old, man or woman, parents or not, able-bodied or disabled, and so on. However, there are some broad similarities in what it takes for people to flourish. We do share certain biophysical features. We get sick when we drink polluted water. A baby's growth is stunted when fecal bacteria makes its way into the human gut. Nobody is comfortable sleeping in a traffic median. So even as I say this and draw closer towards a basic needs and services approach, which makes me quite uncomfortable at some level, I want to point out that the universal does not mean uniform and does not preclude the context specific. So noting the range of things that allow people everywhere to thrive is difficult, and I'm not quite there yet. So in a way, I'm sort of offering it as an idea, and I would love to get your response to this. What I do know is that such an approach focuses attention on the challenges of whitening or valorizing the informal. Note that I do not say formalizing the informal, as an earlier generation of scholarship insisted. There are always problems in this valorization, as what happened with the Wahia and the Zabalin when the municipality of Cairo sought to get rid of donkey carts and insisted that the Zabalin buy trucks, or when the government of Egypt culled pigs in an attempt to stem the spread of the flu virus. The challenge, nevertheless, is to support capacities for innovation and growth in systems of production and maintenance, while constraining and restricting capacities for exploitation and exclusion. So before I move into looking at specific design intervention, I want to sort of consider the acts that go into design. And I started thinking about this in some more detail when we had a conference last year at Cornell, on very much the same set of topics, actually, where we invited people from across the world to come and think with us about design tactics and the informalized city. And we were a team of 4 faculty at Cornell who organized this, an architect, two architects, a landscape architect, and myself. I'm both an architect and a planner. So, so I've been thinking about this for some time now, and the idea of what does one do when you design? You survey, enumerate, and map in order to diagnose and then evaluate a particular condition, process, or practice, and then we act. So to deconstruct this design process in such ways is to go beyond sort of simply rethinking design in the context of informality as design for the other 90% of the world, where the client just changes. So what we're trying to do here is to think about surveying, enumeration, and mapping, about which I'm sure we'll hear, when I look at the talk titles, we'll hear a lot more about this in the coming days. But what these processes do is to reveal and expose and make available certain forms of knowledge, certain practices of occupying urban space. Solly Benjamin called these practices occupancy urbanism. What should be clear is the questions that lay behind the mapping and revealing. Whose knowledge is being exposed? For what purposes? And who stands to benefit or lose from this exposure? Do interstitial spaces disappear, like the ones that I was showing you before in the slides? Do rights and property established through routine practice and use get banished? Do they make evident the conditions of our own indoctrination and reveal new possibilities in representation? So mapping and creating these new forms of representation also allow us to diagnose and evaluate various conditions and to make critical normative evaluations based on which we choose to act. I want to consider two of these actions in a little more detail. And I'm showing you a set of slides which are going to be part of the book that we are sort of getting ready to put together. So this is the work of Maurice Mitchell's students. He teaches in London. And these are students who went to India, and he talks about the architect as craftsman, as detective, as narrator, who really begins to investigate various conditions, practices, and processes, and in the process of doing so, engages with the community. And this is in another area called Jagdamba, where Maurice also worked with his students. And you begin to see how they are beginning to represent the various actions that take place in this particular community. I want to discuss two projects briefly. I'm going to start with Bremberg and Klumpner's cable car station interventions in Caracas, Venezuela. The urban think tank, which the architects co-direct, came up with this idea when they were faced with this problem of water and lack of access and mobility in the slums of Caracas in Venezuela. Bremberg describes this as acupuncture. He describes his work as acupuncture, which concentrates and consolidates infrastructure and creates, as the slide says, hotspots of urban activity. So there are multiple sites in which they've worked, and you can see it in this one. The three, do you see them here? The one right on top over there, there's one site over here, and that's the third. What is really interesting about each of these sites is that it isn't just a cable car station. Various uses are layered onto the site. So there's one which is a museum, one which is a music hall, not a museum, a community center, one which is a music hall, and a third which is a gym. And they're beautiful buildings, used quite heavily, though this slide doesn't quite represent that. Here's the gym. Here's another project, slum networking. Here, the idea is somewhat different. The father-son duo of Himanshu and Preeti Parekh worked in India, in the city of Indore, in the center of India, and they came up with this idea of doing slum networking. What is slum networking? It's very simple, and the three sort of principles are laid out there. The roads that go through the centers of slums are sunk below ground, and they slope along with the topography. There are no storm drains needed because the road acts as the channel to collect the water flow when the rains come once a year. There are very shallow sewers, and they've sort of invented, they used appropriate technology to create a particular kind of manhole. So what the slum networking project does is to see the slums, which is what we call settlements in India, as opportunities to solve problems rather than as problems themselves. So it's infrastructure upgrading, a simple idea using appropriate technology through topography management. They do a lot of cut and fill. There are no pumping stations. And roads are designed, as I said before, to carry water flow during the rainy season. So what we have then is that in connecting the slums, you are developing a city-level infrastructure all across this entire city, which has more than 3 million, I think, in population. So it uses community networks to maintain the drains, another idea that borrows on upgrading policies. And while maybe 500,000 people were served within the slums by this slum networking idea, an equal number was served outside. The project has been tried in many different parts of India, and in other countries as well, especially in East Africa and in South Africa. The interesting part for me about this project is that it relies on partnerships with corporate actors to be able to get the project going. So that becomes then its Achilles heel. How does one really begin to think about involving the community, which has very different kinds of capabilities, along with corporate actors who come in to support the building and of this particular form of infrastructure? So I just wanted to share these two short projects briefly to give you an idea of what I'm going to suggest as propositions. Oh, so this is the Indore River before and after the slum networking project. So, advancing equity in the informal city. I'd like to end with three possible propositions. One is to survey and map, keeping in mind the questions why and for whose benefit the exercise is undertaken. The second is to create connected infrastructure, as Breumberg and Klumpner would have it, that breaks through these segregated spaces of the city that are created constantly. And the third is to layer uses, to mediate between these systems of production and the systems of maintenance that I described earlier, and to maximize gains that have normative value beyond the subjective impulse. So I'll end there. Thank you.